welcome everybody. As we all know, no doubt, next year is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and so there's a lot of interest and examination being brought on the events of the Revolutionary War. And I've written this as a follow-up to my book on the Battle of White Plains, charting the very, very dirty war that went on here in Westchester County between White Plains and the end of the war. And I think, I know everybody here is very well versed in the Bronx and to some extent Westchester history, but I think I'll have a few surprises for everybody. There always is when you research a book. I'm going to sit down so I'm not in anybody's way. So this is the revolution as we would like to remember. Everybody, crisply attired and with flags and banners and observing, punctilious military courtesy. The etiquette of war, it was sometimes described as. And to a great extent, this did happen. But beneath all the flags and the fol-de-rol, you had a much nastier, messier business going on. In many ways, the revolution was the first American Civil War taking place, not just here in Westchester, but many places throughout the country. The Jersey Pine Barrens, the Hackensack Valley, the Mohawk Valley, where this particular massacre is taking place, and to a greater or lesser extent in all 13 colonies. And the events in Westchester County are what I'm going to sketch out for you tonight. And I can only scratch the surface. There's a lot more detail in the book, so just a little bit of advertisement there. So Westchester County was termed the neutral ground, and the way we use this word today, we might think it was like some kind of a Switzerland where everybody was left alone and kept quiet, but it meant nothing of the sort. It was basically it was a no man's land between the two armies. Now, in our 20th century, 21st century conception, we assume the armies are constantly in contact with one another, like World War I or World War II. You had fronts where there's a constant exchange of action. Not so in the 18th century. 18th century, okay, you had a campaign, you had a battle, and then the sides would break off. Best thing to do is like a good 20-mile distance was considered comfortable. About a day's march, but not so close that either side could surprise the other easily. So throughout the war, after the Battle of White Plains, the emphasis of the war shifted to New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and other places. For the most part, the Americans held their lines along the line of the Croton River, which is the dark line at the top of the map. But the British did not try to occupy Westchester. They held enclaves. They held the bridgeheads coming off Manhattan Island, Kingsbridge, Farmers Bridge, Fort No. 8, and also a Loyalist enclave, which we'll get into a little bit more, that existed West Farms and Morrisania. Now, from time to time, the Americans would advance their forward lines down to a line roughly Tarrytown, White Plains, hence the dotted line in the middle of the map. But basically, everything from the Croton River to Kingsbridge was the neutral ground. Now, you all know this, but I'll say it anyway. Westchester County in the 18th century included the present-day Bronx. Bronx wasn't, as you all know, no doubt, it didn't begin to get split off from Westchester until the 1870s. It then only became a county in the 20th century. So when I say Westchester, this includes everything, Croton River, all the way down Long Island Sound, Harlem River. Now, the revolution was not a sudden cataclysmic event. It been like a 10-year buildup, beginning with the Stamp Act and the Townsend duties, and contention had been growing, and polarization was taking place over a 10-year period. More and more people were taking sides, either for the British administration or against it. lovely picture on the left there. I took this in Colonial Williamsburg, where they reenacted some of the street theater that took place in New York City, Charleston, all the different cities of the country. Now here in Westchester, more particularly in the Bronx, the revolution was preceded by what was called the Pamphlet War. This is a thing gentlemen did back in the 18th century. This was the 18th century version of podcasting, if you will. You wrote pamphlets, free thoughts on the proceedings of the Continental Congress, or something like that. And these would go around, they'd end up in the taverns. You'd have like maybe 10 or 20 readers for every one that was actually bought. And our chief pamphleteer here, he's buried over in his pulpit was in St. Peter's Church and also St. Paul's in Eastchester, the Reverend Samuel Seabury, who issued a number of pamphlets that he signed a Westchester farmer. Now, back then it was considered perfectly good to issue these pamphlets under a pseudonym. You didn't sign your own name. This way nobody showed up at your doorstep with a horsewhip, So he signed himself a Westchester farmer, even though he was Westchester, but in no way a farmer. Now you can get a sense from this portrait of his that he was a man who was accustomed to being taken seriously when he spoke. After all, he was a reverend. He gave sermons twice every Sunday in 2 different churches. So you can imagine the annoyance that must have come to him when he learned that his brilliant pamphlets arguing for support of the king and the Constitution were being refuted by some smart aleck college kid in Manhattan. And the funny thing is that the smart aleck kid literally was a smart aleck. It was, you don't recognize this early portrait, it was a very young Alexander Hamilton. He was in his second year at what was then King's College, we call it Columbia University today. And he was issuing pamphlets of Farmer Refuted, and he was arguing pro-independence. And the irony in all this is that good old Samuel Seabury, thinking, he was defending the king and the Constitution and rallying, support for the old order, he's unwittingly gave his support to launching the career of one of the founders. Because young Alex, second year of college, you don't know exactly, where your life is going to go. In writing these pamphlets, Alex had a revelation that, A, he was very good at political argument, and he was a very good writer, and, that revelation eventually took him to the heights of the founders. So by the time the Declaration of Independence was issued, and it was read out on the steps of the White Plains Courthouse, it was then the county seat, 11th of July, 1776, much of Westchester County had already polarized. Most people had taken up sides, one side or the other. And the funny thing about this picture is that they're standing on the steps of the courthouse. About 50 yards away was a tavern that was a notorious Loyalist hangout, where in fact the year before, Loyalists had gathered to sign the Declaration of Dependence. But yet a catty-corner across the road from the Hatfield Tavern, the Loyalist hangout, was the Oakley Tavern, which was a rallying point for the Patriots and the pro-independence faction. So this guy gives you an idea of how, divided the county was becoming already. Now, for many Loyalists, this was not a polite conversation like you had in the Pamphlet War. Both sides were not shy about using physical force and intimidation against the other side. And particularly the Loyalists, they found themselves in a place where the Patriots were more active or outnumbered the number of Loyalists. Things that you can see from these pictures, things would get very rough for them. So early in the war, a lot of people were literally being driven from their homes and farms by Patriot violence. And they headed south to a Loyalist enclave, which I'll get to in a moment. But I want to mention there was a third force in Westchester County in those days, And that was the Quakers, the Society of Friends as they're properly known. Now, you say Quaker and, we naturally would think of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and, the guy in the oatmeal box. But it's not very well known that New York and New Jersey, particularly southern New York, was as much a Quaker haven as Pennsylvania was. And southern Westchester County had several congregations. Their term was meetings, but there were congregations dating back to the 1670s, very substantial Quaker population. Now, the trouble of being a Quaker, as you no doubt know, is that they totally eschewed violence, political or military in any form. And in a polarized situation, both sides had the attitude, whoever's not for us, actively supporting us, well, you must be against us. You must be a closet Tory if you're not, paying taxes in the Continental Congress. So these people wound up catching it from both sides, with very, very little mercy shown. Now, one guy who's going to dominate the story, he's a local guy, a local Bronx guy, James Delancey. No doubt come across this name in many places in New York City. Now, James Delancey was the son of a fellow known as Peter of the Mills. He owned a set of water-powered grist and sawmills right about at the southern end of the Bronx River Gorge, just above where the dam is at about 182nd Street. That was the one remaining dam from that time. And it was quite wealthy. Peter had died, but James was the heir apparent to the family fortune. And he was a staunch loyalist. He never made any doubt about where his loyalties lay. And he would open up his estate in West Farms and also parts of the Morris estate in Morrisania as a shelter, as a haven for fugitive Tories coming down from the farms being burned out in Westchester County. And this is about where the family mansion was. You've no doubt recognize, you've seen this 100 times. That's a good picture, I just want to show off. But that's 182nd Street Dam, and there has been a dam on this location pretty much continuously since the 1670s. So Peter's mills had already been grinding for about 100 years by the time he passed on. And the actual mansion is off to the right, in what today is the Wild Asia section of the Bronx Zoo. There's no trace remaining of it. I would dearly love to do an archaeological excavation there, but the zoo, they don't want anybody interfering with the elephants, so just have to stay on the ground. But you recognize that's the monorail in the background that takes you through Wild Asia. And the Delancey estate pretty much occupied the footprint of the present-day Bronx Zoo, including the famous rocking stone. Delancey loved to have high-ranking guests come up, for a Masterpiece Theater kind of weekend, and they would go for carriage rides all along the Bronx River. And at the rocking stone, stop the carriage, and Delancey would get out. He was a pretty muscular guy. Actually, a single person could rock the stone back and forth, or if he needed help, 2 or 3 guys could rock it back and forth. And that was kind of the highlight of the trip. So he opened up a haven for loyalists and established a cantonment roughly about where St. Mary's Park is, on 149th Street. And he organized the able-bodied men into an armed militia to strike back at the Patriots. Now, this band was never incorporated into the British Army. Reasons why, I don't know, but they were always a private ad hoc group, and they went by several names. Delancey's Refugees, the Westchester Refugees, the Associated Loyalists, the Westchester Chasseurs, or most commonly, the Cowboys. Now, this was where the term cowboy entered the American English language. And it did not mean guys in the white hats, it didn't mean Hopalong Cassidy. These were the bad guys, and they were named as such because Delancey's troop made a habit of raiding up and down the Bronx River Valley and throughout Westchester and stealing people's cattle. Mostly Patriot cattle, but maybe not asking too many questions. Because they needed money. They'd drive the cattle to Kingsbridge, and British commissaries would pay serious money, I mean gold and silver, for beef on the hoof. The term cowboy would not come to mean the good guys until well into the 20th century. Now on the Patriot side, you had free roaming bandits that were known as skinners. And there's a lot of controversy about where this term came from. But generally, they were bandits that claimed to be operating on the side of the Patriots. Maybe so, maybe no. I suspect sometimes that depended on who they were robbing. The side they, open in the name of King George, you damned rebel. So I'm a loyalist. Oh, I'm sorry, did I say King George? I meant the other George. What's his name? George Washington. Yes. Open in the name of George Washington, you accursed Tory. Loyalties were very, very flexible. Now, I'll just treat you, this is my theory of where the name Skinners came from. It may be nothing more than the fact that they robbed people of their clothing. But the Skinners were notorious for their habit of trashing the homes they invaded. They'd go in, they'd rob the joint, take all the valuables, and then they'd smash up the furniture, and then they'd even go to the trouble of ripping the wallpaper down, literally skinning the walls. So take it or leave it, that's my theory. Now, Westchester in the Revolution, it was not far from a backwater, really. It had some of the most prominent small unit commanders in the war. And apart from James Delancey, perhaps the most prominent was John Graves Simcoe. Now, if you remember the series Turn, he is portrayed in that series, and he's portrayed as a very comically psychotic character. He's one of these television people, you come on screen, you know something fun's going to happen in about 2 minutes. But this is totally unlike the actual personality of John Graves Simcoe. He was totally devoted to his cause, fighting for the king. And apart from being comically psychotic, he was rather known for being humorless. He wasn't a mean guy. He didn't have a reputation of being mean or bloodthirsty, but he just tell the joke, he'd just look at you, you know. And others, this guy is probably a bit more famous, Bannister Tarleton. The best adjective for him, I would say dashing. He was 24 years old in 1776. He was a commander of British Dragoons and an incredibly active, wiry sort of person, and eventually would acquire some very uncomplimentary nicknames, such as Bloody Dan, the Green Dragoon, or there's a few I won't even repeat. But here in Westchester, he'd be most famous for the burning of the town of Bedford and White Plains later in the war. And then eventually he went to the Southern Theater of Command and really got an awful reputation. He was an interesting character. You can tell he was a very handsome dude. You know, the girls loved him. He loved the girls too, perhaps too often. But one other person, this guy kind of fell through the cracks. Andreas Emmerich. He was a Hessian unit commander, and he formed this band, Emmerich's Chasseurs. They were a combination of footloose Hessians and American deserters, you know, from the American side. And in their brief period, they were one of the most feared units operate in the neutral ground. They came to a bad end. I mean, these people were so combative, they wound up fighting each other. And the British eventually broke them up and sent Emmerich home. Now this guy, I always think of him as a very tragic figure here in the neutral ground, Beverly Robinson. He was a loyalist. He was a childhood friend of George Washington back in Fredericksburg, Virginia. But Beverly came north, married into the staunchly loyalist Phillips clan, who at one time literally owned about a quarter of Westchester County. And he got himself a very nice estate as a present-day garrison overlooking West Point and the Hudson River. And like so many others, he had to flee his home and never return to it. This house would eventually become the headquarters of Benedict Arnold, of all people. That's another story. And he formed a very well-regarded unit, the Royal American Regiment, that served throughout the war here in Westchester and the Hudson Valley. And they had really cool uniforms. Basically, they were green uniforms with red facings. So they must have got a lot of invitations to the Christmas party. Trouble with the uniforms, there was very much a stratification of who got to wear what color. Back then, we think the Americans were all in blue and the British were all in red. This is not true. The red royal livery for the British was reserved only for the regular redcoats. If you were a loyalist volunteer, you didn't qualify to wear the red, and they made sure you didn't. Your assigned color would be green, and likewise dragoons would wear green too. And this would lead to a lot of very tragic misunderstandings throughout the war, but I'll detail those later. Now, the Americans had some interesting characters too. Most prominent, operating here in Westchester, was Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee. And if you're wondering, because this portrait may give you the impression, he was the father of Robert Edward Lee of the Civil War. And in a lot of ways, he was a counterpart to Bannister Tarleton. It wasn't quite as vicious as Tarleton, but he had his moments. One of my favorite incidents was later in the war. He caught a deserter, and he just had it up to here with deserters. So he ordered the guy shot by firing squad, which was normal. And then he ordered that the guy's head be cut off and stuck on a pole overlooking the parade ground. So everybody marching out for inspection, this guy's had to be looking down on them. Washington was not amused when he learned of this. He said a very interesting reprimand. Washington's correspondence, you could always tell when he's really annoyed with somebody, because then he gets very starchy and formal. And his letter to Lee read something like, I pray, sir, in future cases of this kind that you not diversify the punishment. But later in the war, I was mentioning how the green uniforms led to tragic results. These dragoons wore green, Tories wore green, and North Carolina, in the fighting in 1780, coming up the road, there's a whole band of loyalists getting together to march off and aid the British. They're all in the green uniforms. And clopping down the road comes Lighthorse Harry's American Dragoons. Well, these guys, green uniforms, I mean, they must be our guys, hey, God save the king, by Jove. And Lee kept a straight face about it. He just had his guys mingle among them, yeah, God save the king, and they gave the signal, and out came the swords. It's known as the Piles Massacre. There's a monument there to this day in North Carolina. Yeah, he could be very, very ruthless on occasion. And this is a personal favorite because I'm partly of Breton descent. And this guy was from Brittany, today we would call France, and with a very swashbuckling story behind him. He was a member of one of the elite French regiments. And being an aristocrat, he got into a lot of duels back then. Well, one duel, he wound up wounding a guy who turned out to be a cousin of King Louis XVI. Uh-oh, not a good move. So he hightailed it to the nearest port, got on the ship to America, just like one step ahead of the guys who were going to throw him into the Bastille. And he got to Chesapeake Bay. He had to jump ship to avoid being captured by the British, swam ashore, walked to Philadelphia, and got himself a commission as a colonel. But he was a very effective unit of a dragoon regiment. And he served here in Westchester County a couple of times. He was one guy that made James Delancey nervous, because Colonel Armand, as he liked to be known, made a hobby of trying to nab James Delancey. He never did, but it was not for lack of trying. And this guy, there's another Armand Louis de Gouton, Duc de Lauzun. absolutely the best dressed unit ever to come here to Westchester. He commanded, it was literally a mercenary force in the French service. There's something like about 15 different nationalities in the Zune's Legion. But they were hussars, and they had that great splendid uniform, the tall shako and the gold embroidered vest, and the little half cape over one shoulder, and huzzah, that's where they got their name from. He came within he actually forced James Delancey to evacuate Morrisania at one point. But you never see such splendidly attired men again. Now, on the American side, now most of these people have no picture that I can offer you, but there was a corps of men known as the Westchester Guides. Now, problem, we're in the 18th century. Maps, you had good nautical charts, but maps of inland areas were really quite terrible. They just give you like a point to point, from, say like you want to get from Tarrytown to White Plains, there's a road there, but it gave you no sense of the terrain or the water courses or anything, or the byways or the farm lanes, all the things you need when you're fighting a war. So whenever the Americans were making a move here in Westchester, they'd have to call on some of these people, the Westchester Guides, and two among them prominent were the two Odell brothers, Abraham Odell and Isaac Odell. And Isaac had a great nickname. I don't know why they didn't put this on the monument in Tarrytown. He was known as Uck Odell. Because believe it or not, I don't know why people do this, there were no less than 4 Isaac Odells running around Westchester County at the same time. I mean, dudes, like get a baby book or something, let's see a little creativity here. But the Odells were among the most active and effective of the Westchester Guides. And one of a very interesting character was John Dean. Now, as far as I know, there's no relationship to the Watergate John Dean. I mean, who knows? I may learn otherwise tomorrow, but he was a very, very effective Westchester Guide. He was one of the people who handled the capture of John Andre in 1780. And when he wasn't on duty, he waged his own private war against the Tories. And it's hard to see in this picture, it's the best I can do, but there's a spot there, it's right alongside the southbound Sawmill River Parkway. It's known as John Dean's Rock. It's a big, huge glacial erratic. And he would hide out there to ambush any passing Tories that would come along. And by the way, his rifle is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, if you want to go see it. But the youngest of the Westchester Guides, and this is being the youngest of many lived long enough to get photographed, was Andrew Corson, one of our local Bronx kids here. And one day, he was 17 years old, and one day in 1781, gathered in the dooryard of his farm, was the entire American High Command. There was George Washington, there's the Count de Rochambeau, there was Lafayette, you name them, they were all gathered there. Why were they there at the farm, which today is roughly the footprint of Fordham University campus? Again, they had no maps. Washington was trying to scout out a way that he could take the combined French and American armies and barrel his way onto Manhattan Island and recapture New York City. So they needed help. Andrew stepped forward. He knew all the lanes and byways. And they rode all up and down the Harlem River. They were up at Spite and Dival, no good. They looked at Fort Number 8. They almost got killed by cannonade. They rode all the way down through the South Bronx. They were looking at Randall's Island. Maybe we could go by this way. None of this stuff worked out. So it was very disappointing, and eventually dropped Andrew off at his farmhouse door. Whereupon his dad was very angry. His dad was a loyalist. And as a consequence of Andrew's action, he disowned Andrew. So when after the war, the Corsa farm was confiscated as loyalist property, poor Andrew had no claim to it. He'd been disowned. So he lost everything. It was a very, very poor reward for being a patriot. Now, just throw it a mention, because she didn't actually command any units, but a very prominent person who served here in the neutral ground was Deborah Sampson, the woman soldier of the Revolution, who took on a male guise as a man, served in a Massachusetts unit based at West Point, and actually she got wounded in Sleepy Hollow, which almost led to her discovery, but not quite. She had a sore blow to the head, and she went in the hospital, patched my head up. But she didn't mention she had a bullet wound in one of her legs. She kept quiet about that, because they'd have to pull her pants down and all would be lost. Well, they patched her head up, and then she went off into the woods. And I'll tell you, people were tough back then. You got to admire them. She took out a jackknife, no anesthesia or antiseptics, dug the bullet out of her leg, bound herself up, and then just went back to duty. One tough lady. If you ever get a chance, there is a lovely young woman by the name of Judith Calaora, who personifies Deborah Sampson. It's like a one-woman show, play. And she is brilliant. If you ever get a chance to see her perform, you will think as you come to know Deborah Sampson.
What's her name, Stephen?
Judith Calaora, K-A-L-A-A-O-R-A. Yeah. So there were several, I'm not going to try to recite all the actions that took place in the neutral ground, because there are just too many to fit into an hour. And I'm sure a lot of them we just don't know about. I'm sure a lot of skirmishes and clashes that never got recorded or written up in after action reports. But one of the most famous was the attack on the Ward House in Tuckahoe. Now, what prompted that was that an American raid went all the way down to Morrisania, taking a bash at the Tories down there. They captured some cattle, they captured some people, they rode up the White Plains Road to the Ward House in Tuckahoe, and they figured nobody's going to follow us, so they were like getting the cattle sorted out, the militiamen were getting their discharge papers. Surprise, they were being followed. And there was a very, very sharp action that took place in the Ward House. And a very prominent, very promising young officer was killed, Captain Samuel Crawford, who's commemorated on this monument. If you're going up the White Plains Road through Tuckahoe, you'll pass this. Quick advertisement, there is a group of people, the Friends of the Stephen Ward House, who are trying to preserve this, keeping it from being demolished by a developer, and we're eventually opening this as an historic house museum. They have just, a few weeks ago, they secured funding from Westchester County. So it's a go. I can't tell you when it's going to open, but these people really deserve an applause. And perhaps one of the most famous and bloody clashes of the neutral ground was what's called the Stockbridge Massacre, sometimes called the Battle of Kingsbridge. It's called the Bronx Massacre on the monument out in Wisconsin. This was a group of Native Americans. They were Wappinger people from up the Hudson Valley who had been dispossessed of their lands by, guess who, the Phillipses. They're a very, very acquisitive group, the Phillips family. So they moved to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, where there was a Christian Indian mission, and without being asked twice, they certainly sided with the Americans when the war broke out. In fact, they showed up at the Battle of Bunker Hill. They were in service that early. On the last day of August, 1778, they were surprised by a combined force of an all-star cast: John Graves Simcoe, James Delancey, Bannister Tarleton. And within about an hour or so, Chief Daniel Ninham and 17 of his men lay dead in what today, you see the monument on the right, it's the northeast corner of Van Cortlandt Park, which is still commemorated to this day. Burial site's a little uncertain, but it's probably, I would say, within a half a mile of this monument, give or take a few feet. But there's also, if you're ever up around Fishkill, there's a magnificent new monument to Daniel Ninham. was just unveiled a few years ago. I've got a full-length picture of it in the book. So he's very well remembered. He's remembered by a powwow and the name of Ninum Mountain up in Putnam County. Well, something like this demands payback. Summer 1778, the Tories and the British were running amok all over the place. So the Americans had to get some kind of response to this, and the response was the Battle of Edgar's Lane. Last day of September 1778, just a month after the Stockbridge Massacre. This is about where Hastings-on-Hudson is today. If you're driving up Route 9, you'll literally drive right through the battlefield. And there's a wonderful set of historic, informational plaques set up at the battle site. So you can pull over, it'll walk you through the battle and do a better job of telling the story than I can, but it's well worth checking out. But basically, Americans, including Light Horse Harry Lee, ambushed a patrol of Hessians coming up the Albany Post Road, as it was known then. And the action was very sharp and bloody. At least 28 Hessians were killed laying in the roadway, mostly by sword blows. So this is a kind of, this is the way the war was going. You had action, you had payback for the payback, and back and forth and back and forth. Now, one notable incident, and this starred a cousin of mine, distant cousin, admittedly, Aaron Burr. Now, winter after the Battle of Edgar's Lane, the beginning of 1779, Colonel Burr, as he was then known, was given command of the American lines that were then around on the Tarrytown White Plains line. And he'd been hearing about all the stuff James Delancey and the Tories had been doing all summer. And he decided he just had it up to here with James Delancey. He was going to teach him a thing or two. So Aaron Burr was not a guy who liked to sit still for very long. He was very action-oriented, let's go do it, even a bit manic on occasion. Now, Delancey had a blockhouse that guarded his Tory enclave as the southernmost bridge over the Bronx River, about 179th Street and Boston Road today. Burr decided to target this. In the middle of February, decided on a night raid. He would take some earthenware vessels, fill them full of lamp oil, have guys carry them, other guys with torches. Molotov cocktails hadn't been invented yet. But they rode up to the blockhouse, and we don't have a picture of it. It was probably like this one in Nova Scotia. These things were all built to a standard pattern. So they rode up the blockhouse. They tossed the lamp oil vessels in through the windows. Other guys threw the torches in, and the thing just went up like a Bic lighter. And the garrison tumbled out to surrender. Amazingly, nobody was killed or injured. But Burr took about 30 prisoners, and within about 20 minutes, they were all galloping back up the White Plains Road. By the time James Delancey woke up, came down there, his nice fine blockhouse was a pile of cinders. And one more raid on Morrisania. Now this is interesting. This is the beginning of 1781. This was deemed deserving of a bicentennial commemorative postcard back in 1981, the Morrisania raid. And again, it was payback for payback for payback. It was William Hull took a partyman down from the Croton River, raided Morrisania. It was a tremendously successful raid. They did a lot of damage. But again, there had to be a payback for this. And the payback turned out to be the Pines Bridge Massacre. Pines Bridge was where Yorktown Heights is today. If you went all the way up north of the Croton River. And he was able to surprise one of the most prominent units in the American Army, the 1st Rhode Island. And these guys, this was a rare example of a truly integrated unit. Most of them were African Americans, either freedmen or guys who'd been released from slavery. And they had these uniforms that were provided by the French. This very tall mitre hat with a big, huge anchor on it. It was quite a flash outfit. There was a couple of companies of European men, but there was also a large party of Narragansett Native Americans, and all commanded by a distant cousin of Colonel Greene. And they were taken by surprise. The Delancey hit just after dawn, and there was a very, very nasty fight at the Davenport House, which actually is still standing, but I won't show a contemporary picture because it's very much a private residence. You can't visit it. Though, once in a great while, the Yorktown Historical Society will arrange for guided tours of the house. But at least 10 men were killed, maybe more, and we're not sure where they're buried either, including Colonel Greene. But if you ever get to go to downtown New Yorktown Heights, this is truly an amazing monument. This is probably the most diverse military monument we've got, and it's done with painstaking accuracy. See the African guy there with his hat, and Colonel Greene's there on the right, and behind them is a Narragansett man in classic Algonquin fighting stance, a weapon in each hand, tomahawk here, pistol there. And the sculptor did this with such accuracy, you could tell this guy was a Narragansett because of the distinctive style of the moccasins he's wearing. They went to that length of accuracy. And Colonel Greene, for his part, is depicted barefoot because he was literally tumbled out of bed by the surprise attack. So if you get a chance, definitely head up that way. And the fighting went on like right to the very end of the war. We think of Battle of Yorktown, October 1781, that was the end of the war. Well, no, it wasn't. It was at the end, for like the major armies that stood down, but small units and action in the neutral ground kept on going. And one late casualty was another Westchester guide, name of Brahma Diekman, or Dykeman, people tend to pronounce it. It should be Diekman. And if you're wondering if this is any relation to the Diekman farmhouse on 200th Street and Broadway, Manhattan, it's worth visiting if you ever go there. That was the family home that they were driven from, at the outset of the war. But he went on a raid down Morrisania, once again trying to nab James Delancey, who, by the way, had a $30,000 price on his head. It'd make a nice payday if you get your hands on him. Failed to get Delancey, but they're riding back up the White Plains Road, and then they were caught in what today is downtown Mount Vernon, where this historical marker is. Okay, fun stuff. Spies! Westchester was a hotbed of espionage and subversion throughout the war, and it entered American literature. 1818, a young gentleman on the right there, a fellow by the name of James Cooper, came down from upstate New York. He married into, believe it or not, a branch of the Delancey family that were not kicked out of the country, but were still very much, they still had a lot of tainted loyalism about them. But he bought a farm from them where, I don't know if anybody here plays golf, but the Fenway Golf Club in Scarsdale was the site of his farm. And he wanted to be a gentleman farmer, and he wanted to combine a career as a novelist. And he was having trouble coming up with a good idea that would really sell. Well, luckily, a good friend of his was a neighbor, the guy on the left, John Jay. Probably the least colorful of our founders, but probably one of the most brilliant. Well, before he became first Chief Justice, or before he became a diplomat, he ran a spy ring during the war here in the neutral ground. And they would get together, and Jay would tell Cooper all kinds of stories about the spies he handled and the predicaments they got into and the actions that took place. And the important thing is, Jay was a very, very good spy master. He knew the rules, never named names. And Cooper was smart enough not to ask any names. But Cooper took all this in, and he made a book out of it. And the result is The Spy. First American bestseller. And still worth reading today. It's still in print. You can get a copy quite easily. Great, great rollicking story starring Harvey Birch, a guy who took on a guise as a peddler and got into all kinds of adventures and predicaments. Well, the book was hardly out. Everybody was talking about it, and everybody was wondering who was the model for Harvey Birch. Well, I'm not going to swear that this is true, but the first one past the post, getting into print, was a man named Enoch Crosby. Found himself a ghostwriter, and he wrote The Spy Unmasked, in which he claimed to be the model for Harvey Birch, and he laid out all his adventures, which sounded an awful lot like Harvey Birch's. He's very well remembered today. There's at least 3 historical markers that name Enoch Crosby. And he was a journeyman cordwainer, a shoe repairman. And very much like his fictional counterpart, he went around going to farms, need any shoes fixed them, and fix the shoes, get a hot dinner, and sit by the fireplace, listening in, the gossip, the chatter, who's planning what, and what loyalist is planning a raid or getting a band together, and he'd report back to the Americans. And his grave in Carmel is honored to this day, every Memorial Day. And one unusual monument you might not know about, and it's a very rare thing, a monument to a fictional character. Right out, and I'm sorry for the picture, I just cannot get a good picture of this thing. It's a bronze plaque in very low bas-relief. But it depicts, Harvey Birch schlumping along, with his peddler's pack. And what you can't see is just over his shoulder, there's a very ghostly image of George Washington, who in the novel is the spy master. That's right outside. If you go between the parking lot and the front entrance Scarsdale Library, you'll pass this monument. Now, one spy, I'm not going to try to tell you about all the spies, and indeed we don't even know who half the spies were, but one of the most successful spies in the neutral ground was a woman. And her mission turned out to be one of the most consequential of anybody's report. Her name was Ann Bates, Philadelphia school teacher who again was driven from her home when Americans reoccupied Philadelphia. And she volunteered her services as a spy. Now there were some advantages, certainly there are disadvantages doing this as a woman, but certain advantages too. Because again, it's the 18th century, gender roles were very, very strictly segregated. And most men, I'm sure most women too, would just take it for granted that, guns and weapons and flags and strategy and tactics, that's all guy stuff, and a woman would neither know nor care about any of this sort of thing, So she took on the guise as a peddler, believe it or not, just like Harvey Birch. And she took to wandering, the roads of Westchester. And she didn't do it in her ball gown. She wore very raggedy clothes and, had a dirty face. And her guise was Mrs. Barnes. She's a poor woman who'd been widowed by the war, just trying to scrape by, selling combs and buttons, twisted tobacco. Well, all the stuff soldiers needed and weren't supplied by the army. So Mrs. Barnes was able to wander into the American camp, which at this time was in the vicinity of White Plains and North Castle. And great perimeter security here. She's just an old widow woman. She's trying to get a couple shillings, for selling doodads to soldiers. What harm could she possibly do? Well, a lot of harm, because Ann Bates, despite being a woman, she was married to a guy who was an armorer for the British Army. He was a guy responsible for keeping the muskets in working order and various things. So consequently, Ann, who was a very intelligent woman, she was educated, she was a school teacher, and she knew her way around an army camp. She knew all this guy stuff. So poor Mrs. Barnes, she's going around, she's selling combs and buttons, and she's keeping her eyes open, looking at tents. There's an officer's tent, there's a colonel, there's a general, and there's a regimental flag there, okay, very interesting. So many men in this unit. Oh, and there's some guns. There's a 3-pounder, there's a 12-pounder. Oh, and a howitzer too. There's a howitzer right over there. And she's keeping all this in her head. She makes her way back to New York without being caught. And she turned in a startlingly accurate report of the numbers and condition of the American Army in White Plains in the summer of 1778. Now this proved consequential because the British commander, Henry Clinton, was, he was a guy kind of liked to dither. British were very good at dithering in this war, but particularly Henry Clinton. Now he knew that there was an attack being planned on the British garrison Newport, Rhode Island. And he wanted to hang on to Newport. So he just dispatched 5,000 men to reinforce the garrison. And no sooner than he did so, he started to wonder, oh, I don't know, we have few enough troops to begin with, and I just sent 5,000 guys away. What if George Washington comes down to me like a ton of bricks and I lose New York? It's like a very bad deal as it would turn out to be. Well, luckily he saw Ann's report, and he could conclude Washington was in no condition to storm Manhattan Island. Now, it turned out to be consequential in another way in recent times. Because while Anne was making her way around the army camp, two different occasions, also innocently, she just happened to wander into Washington's headquarters, which was in the Purdy House, which still stands today. And he still says, guys are still trying to get in to have a word with Washington. And she just happened to wander in, and of course they hustle out, what are you doing here? Out, scat. But on one occasion, she had a glimpse of George himself disappearing around a corner. She included that in her report because she could confirm that the Americans camped Washington's headquarters there in the Purdy House on Water Street. And 2 centuries later, there was some contention going on. You might recall the Miller House up in the northern part of White Plains. For many years, it was run by the Daughters of the American Revolution. You might recall a sign on the parkway, Washington's headquarters this way. And their attitude was, well, we're the real Washington's headquarters, And at the same time, the people who became the White Plains Historical Society were trying to save the Purdy House from demolition. And they were contending that the Purdy House, too, had been Washington's headquarters on at least one occasion, and maybe as many as 3 occasions, but they couldn't prove it. So the people in the Miller House said, no. Well, they did their research. They dug up Ann Bates's report, which she specifically says she was in the Purdy House and she saw George Washington. Aha! It was in the summer of 1778, it was Washington's headquarters. So consequently today, White Plains is a very rare example of a city with 2 Washington's headquarters. And both of them are preserved. They do events at both of these places, and you can visit them. And I'd recommend Purdy House, the last Sunday of this month, they're having a commemoration event of the Battle of White Plains. So if you can make your way up there, I'd really recommend it. It's great fun. There's going to be reenactors and craftspeople and a lot of historical chit-chat going on. So it's.
Was she ever found out? Did she get away with it at all? Or?
She was almost found out. She made several trips into Washington camp. And later in the summer of 1778, she was in the camp. I saw this guy was kind of like looking at her. Strange. And now she wasn't all dolled up. There's no reason this guy'd be like, getting an eyeful of poor Mrs. Barnes. And then she realized, oh, crap. I know this guy. He was in the British Army. He's a deserter now. He's going to rat me out. So, woo. She got out of town real quick and made it back to New York. So yeah, it was a lucky stroke. She spotted him at the same time he spotted her. And the spy war left a mark on the landscape. A lot of different places. A lot of people here recognize this postcard from Tom Casey of the famous Spy Oak that once stood just below Pella Manor, north of Westchester Square. With all kinds of stories about people being hanged on it, and a ghost story, more than one ghost story. In fact, there's shade of a forlorn British officer who occasionally would appear in the middle of the night, or shades of, various bandits or spies that were hanged. None of this is really well documented, but very famous. But there's not the only hanging tree that was famous in Westchester. There's one right here in the Bronx, nearby the Van Cortlandt House in Van Cortlandt Park. Now, it's not clear whether the tree is long gone. It was either close to the house, or it may have been a tree standing in Seton Park, about a mile to the northwest. And crazy stories about that, as many as 30 people being hanged at one time, one of which I have very much doubt. But one that is well documented, though, was in Peekskill. Grounds of the Peekskill Military Academy, the famous Spy Oak, which was standing at a time when a young L. Frank Baum was a student there. Now, whether this influenced the Wizard of Oz in any way, I do not know. But if you go up to Cortlandt Manor, you will pass Gallows Hill Road. What a great address. You know, would you love to have that on your Halloween cards? Or great place for the Addams family to locate. But the Gallows Hill Road is for real. It's been on the map for many years. And you follow Gallows Hill, it will bring you to the top of Gallows Hill with a little body of water known as Spy Pond. And people really were hanged there. There was the middle of an American encampment. I was there off and on several times during the war. And there's one notable incident that took place there. A British lieutenant was caught spying in the camp. Now, the penalty for spying, being out of uniform, as we all know, was death. And he was sentenced to be hanged. The American commander got a letter from the British Royal Governor of New York, William Tryon. And he was arguing, well, this guy, Nathan Palmer, he's a commissioned lieutenant in the British Army. You can't hang him. He's an officer and a gentleman, and it's not right. And, well, he was sending letters to the wrong guy, because the American commander was Israel Putnam. He's a guy who never minced words or suffered any nonsense from anybody. And his response to William Tryon is a classic. Sir, Nathan Palmer, a lieutenant in your service, was taken in my camp as a spy. He was tried as a spy. He was condemned as a spy. And you may rest assured, sir, you shall be hanged as a spy. Yes, afternoon, he is hanged. I feel sorry for Nathan Palmer. And of course, the most famous espionage incident of the war was the Arnold Andre affair, which came to grief beneath a tulip tree in Tarrytown. I won't try to rehearse the whole story. It's amazingly complicated, and it's a subject, enough material there for a whole weekend conference. Now, I've been to some of these conferences. Trust me, it's really, really interesting. But suffice to say, like Nathan Palmer, Major Andre's commission did him no good either, and he was hanged. And there's a very nice monument, you know, sitting on Broadway, right on the border between Sleepy Hollow and Tarrytown. There's one little footnote I want to bring to your attention, because you might not notice this. On the top of the monument, there's a statue of William Paulding, one of the militiamen who busted John Andre. He was traveling under the pseudonym of John Anderson, merchant. And if you stop and look at the monument, don't do this if you're driving, but if you're on foot, stop, take a look at the base of the monument. This statue was donated by John Anderson? What do you know, Andre's donating to his own monument? No, there's a fascinating story. John Anderson was a wealthy tobacconist, and his story involves one of New York City's oldest cold case murder mysteries. A story by Edgar Allan Poe, and a tale of madness and insanity. And not enough time to tell you the whole story, but I've got it in a footnote, the book, because I just can't resist telling you all this. Well, as the war went on, you know, a lot of people, ordinary people, were displaced from their farms and their homes. And you had a lot of rootless people. A lot of people never made it back home. There was nothing to return home to. A couple of prominent examples. And one of them was Sarah Bishop. She was locally famous up in South Salem. She was renowned as a hermit, lived all by herself. And her backstory is a little uncertain, but it seems she was of a family in Long Island whose home was burned down by British raiders. with quite likely Sarah being sexually assaulted by a British officer. Can't prove it, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence. Suffice to say, poor Sarah was traumatized out of her mind by all this, like a lot of people, PTSD during the war. And she wound up on the other side of Long Island Sound up in Fairfield, Connecticut, as just a wandering, hobo person. And she eventually made her way to South Salem, where she spent the rest of her life in this little cave on the left. It's known to this day as Sarah Bishop's Cave. Now, I've been there, and it's not a very big cave. It's about 4 feet wide by 6 feet long. Just about enough room to lie down in. But she spent her whole life there, and she's buried today in South Salem. Now, another famous person, very likely this is a legend, but don't tell that to anybody in Sleepy Hollow, because they'll tell you Huldah of Bohemia was very much for real. She may have been a displaced person. She was a hermit, lived in a little cabin in what today is Rockefeller State Park, right next to a place called Spook Rock, which has its own set of ghost stories. Yeah, she picked her address very well. And she got by as an herbalist. She would gather herbs in the forest, medicinal herbs, and sell them around. Well, she was a very exotic character. She was a woman all on her own, and she was an herbalist. She must be a witch. Now, the Witchcraft Act was long gone. Nobody could do anything about it. But she was pretty much shunned by the Tarrytown community.
Is that her actual tombstone?
It is now,
Because
yeah.
it's in very good shape.
I'll tell you,
Oh.
I'll clue you into the secret. Well, until the British raided Tarrytown, March 1777, and the militia gathered on top of the hill there where Sleepy Hollow Cemetery is today, and Huldah shows up. And as the legend relates, she got hold of a gun, started picking off the British one by one. Somehow she was a crack shot, which the British were not amused by, so they focused their fire on poor Huldah, and she went down in a hail of lead. Well, this being the case, all the people in Tarrytown who had shunned her and ignored her all these years started thinking, maybe this Huldah is not such a bad person. And they searched her cabin. They found a very well-thumbed Bible, rather unusual for a witch, and a little cache of money with a note saying, apply this to the poor people of Tarrytown. So now they're feeling really bad about the way they treated Huldah. So, and again, this is not documented, but the story has it. They decided to bury her in consecrated ground in the Old Dutch Church cemetery. However, on the north side of the church, that's the bad side of the church. That's the shady side, the cold side, and in an unmarked grave. Now, it was only about 2010, the Friends of the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery got together. They hired a very talented historical stone carver named Bob Carpenter to carve poor Huldah a proper tombstone. And today, it's one of the most visited sites in the Old Dutch churchyard. Probably second most popular, because the most popular is Washington Irving himself.
Excuse me, does the tombstone read Huldah the Witch?
Not Huldah, it says Huldah of Bohemia, died circa 1777, herbalist, healer, patriot. Felled by the British while protecting the militia, buried here in gratitude for her sacrifice. So yeah, so people visit the grave all the time. They leave all kinds of offerings on the tombstone, and I find this really weird. This has really caught on in recent years, people leaving stuff on tombstones. But Huldah's a really weird example. I mean, most of them are coins, quarters and dimes and things. And I've seen things like Mardi Gras beads, postage stamps, even the Tootsie Roll Pop. I swear, I've got a picture to prove it. Everybody wants to know. So, but definitely visit. It's easy to spot, and just on the north side of the Old Dutch Church. But if you go, please don't leave any coins on the tombstone, because as you can see, the copper leaches out of the coin. That's why we've got those green streaks running down the tombstone. But on the other hand, if you're short of change for the bus, you know where to go. So the war wound up, and when the armies finally returned to the neutral ground in 1781, the French, under the Comte de Rochambeau, what a uniform he's got, landed in Newport. And in the summer of 1781, they marched inland to hook up with George Washington around Dobbs Ferry in Armonk. And this is what prompted the Grand Reconnaissance, Washington hoping French and Americans could take New York City. Well, it didn't work out. It was a very frustrating affair for Washington, but it was quite a sight when they arrived. Everybody was really thrilled. Now, this painting, you see Washington and Rochambeau reviewing the French troops. And they're all dressed like the Good Humor Man. The summer field livery for the French army was white. White was the color of the Bourbon dynasty. So that's, now, how anybody would campaign in the middle of the summer, dressed like the Good Humor Man to keep yourself clean, I don't know, I'm glad it's another man's problem. But people always ask me what regimental flag that is, so I made sure to check it out. That is the Régiment des Soissonnais, or the Soissons Regiment. One of the better units in the French army. The French did not send us second-rate troops at all. And you see, by the way, our friend Duke de Lauzun is over on the far right. Yeah, he always stands out in the crowd, don't he? Well, Washington and Rochambeau hooked up, and it was a very disappointing Grand Reconnaissance for Washington. A couple of weeks later, probably the most consequential conference of the war took place in this very humble farmhouse, which still stands today in Hartsdale, on the Hartsdale Road. It's known today as the Odell House Rochambeau headquarters. And there's a wonderful group of people, once again, friends of the Odell House, who are restoring it into a museum with an 18th century campus surrounding it. And the word I have is it should be open late sometime next year. So keep an eye on the space. But back then it was just a humble farmhouse. And Washington, his headquarters has been down the road where there's a radio station today. He gets word from Rochambeau, George, come on over, I got some news for you. Rochambeau had learned that the French fleet was coming up from the Caribbean. We need naval power. They weren't going to come up to New York, but they weren't going to go as far as the Chesapeake. And they'd be in the vicinity of the Chesapeake for about a 6-week window of opportunity. So George, how about, now we know George Cornwallis, the British general, is hunkered down in Yorktown, literally up the creek, up the Chesapeake Bay. So if the French fleet arrives, and if they could fend off the British and blockade Chesapeake Bay, and if we can get the French and American army make a midsummer march, 700 odd miles down to Yorktown, Virginia, this could be the winning stroke of the war. And, well, the rest is history, as they say. But it's also commemorated every year by the Dobbs Ferry Historical Society. They lead a grand march from Gould Park in Dobbs Ferry, flags, a fife and drum, the whole 9 yards. And basically they replicate the first mile of the route to Yorktown. So keep an eye on the Dobbs Ferry Historical Society. It's a great fun event if you ever want to attend. So, yes, we come to the end of our tale. I'm going to let you off easy after all this bloodshed and mayhem. Send you off on a lighter note. And we think, what is the most lasting legacy of the Revolution in Westchester County? Yes, it's the Headless Horseman. And look, he's for real. We saw him just last year at Kingston Point Park. And where else? Sleepy Hollow. And if you don't believe the picture, if you go to the Old Dutch Church cemetery, there's a brand new historic marker there telling you that the Headless Horseman tethers his horse there every night. So anyway, I've got a section, I've got an appendix. I'm supposed to be writing history, but I can't help but dip into folklore occasionally. And I've got an appendix in this book in which I consider the possible origins of the Headless Horseman. And his roots may go as far back as Scotland and Ireland, and Germany and southern England. Or, I've got a theory that he may have originated in lower Manhattan. So I'll let you read that, and you're welcome to say I'm crazy. But, so anyway, that wraps it up for us. We're happy to take any questions you might have. I've got a few copies of the book. It's actually not published yet, but you can cheat the publisher.
Is there any truth to the story about when Washington and Rochambeau were leaving to go to Yorktown, lighting the fires on the hills above Van Cortlandt Park to fool the British? I've heard it since I was a little kid.
Me too. I mean, I learned this from school trips, and it's a great story, but I don't think the house was actually occupied by the British at the time. Washington did do a lot of deception operations, and he was known to leave false campfires. But whether this actually happened on Vault Hill and Van Cortlandt Park, I'm not sure. It's too good a story to let go of, but I can't say for real if it's defendable.
Stephen, what about the hemlock forest in the botanical gardens? That was a real militarized zone,
Yeah.
and the Patriots and the Tories were sniping at each other, so they couldn't cut down the trees, and that's why the hemlocks are still
Yeah,
there.
that's right. If you go to nowadays, it's called the Thane Family Forest in the Botanical Gardens, and it's one of the very, very, very last patches of timberland on the East Coast that has never been cut or harvested for lumber. Now, during the war, the British in New York, and so were the American soldiers too, everybody was desperate for firewood. And the British sent out wood-cutting parties all through Jersey, Long Island, any place they could find something to cut down and turn into firewood. And somehow, the Thane Family Forest, the native forest, the hemlock forest, was never cut. Now, there's a legend that there's a rock formation called the Bear's Den. Now, if you're looking for it, it's right at the very north end of the Spice Bush Trail. You're taking a walk through the forest. And the story has it this was a rallying point or a hangout for American partisans. And the American partisans were so active that the British were scared to death to go into this native forest. And consequently, it was never clear-cut. And then we became part of the Lorillard estate. The Lorillards wanted to keep it that way, so it's to this day, it's like the last piece of timberland that's as it was.
How much is it, about 35 acres?
Something like that, yeah.
50 acres,
50.
50?
50.
50.
And wait till the leaves turn. Go this month, later this month, if you want to take a walk in Thane Family Forest.
How many hemlocks are still alive?
I've seen maybe as many as a half a dozen. Yeah,
They're all affected
this
by
is why the name has changed so often, because it was at one time noted for its hemlock. And that too is unusual, because the Lorillards protected the hemlock at a time when the tanning industry was tearing down hemlocks all over New York State. The ones here were left alone and became famous as a stand for hemlock trees. Until the early 2000s, there was a little critter called the woolly adelgid. Made its way up from, I think, the Carolinas. And this thing gets in literally,
From Long Island,
yeah, suck the sap out of.
Hurricane Gloria.
Yeah, and I saw this happen. I grew up in the neighborhood. I lived there still. I saw this happen. Within, I'd say, maybe about 3 years, just about all the hemlocks were dead. So they couldn't call it the hemlock forest anymore. So they called it the native forest until they decided to renovate it. They were going to restore it, bring in native plants, get rid of invasive plants. And this was funded by the Thane family, which, interestingly enough, they did not ask to have their name put on the forest. But they contributed, I think it's something like about $100 million to this effort. So the guard told them, look, you're going to give us that kind of money, you got to get your name on something.
Yeah.
So, all right, name it after us. So today it's the Thane Family Forest. And it, more or less, probably with the exception of chestnut trees, it's pretty much as the Native Americans would have experienced it. Sorry, that was kind of a digression. I used to work for the Bronx River Alliance, so I'm up on all this ecological detail.
Would you say the war was, I've read recently, a war between Anglicans and other types of Protestants?
Well, there was a lot of there is some truth to that, though. I wouldn't, we don't have exact, demographic data, but generally, well, the Anglican Church was the established Protestant church, and everybody had to pay taxes to it. But a lot of people here in New York, not only the Quakers, but a lot of people were Presbyterians. Dissenters, they were known as. And Presbyterians, if you take a look at their church structure, these people were Republicans before anybody thought of founding a republic. Very much a bottom-up system of church governance. So consequently, Presbyterians tended, now I'm sure this didn't apply to everybody, but Presbyterians pretty much tended to be on the independent side. And the Anglicans, like Reverend Seabury, tend to be on the native side. If you go to Newark, where the old village green is in Newark, there's an interesting story. There's an Anglican church that still stands at the north end of what was then the village green. And the Presbyterian church was on the south end. And when the revolution broke out, they read the Declaration of Independence, the pro-independence guys got together and they trashed the Anglican church. Well, then when the Americans were losing the war and Washington retreated through Newark and kept on going down to the Delaware, the Anglicans got together and they went down and trashed the Presbyterian church. So I'm sure a lot of instances like that happen in many, many places.
You mentioned the Quakers. Well, St. Peter's in Westchester Square had, I think, 2 Quaker churches that didn't like each other.
Yeah, you had that split happen in the early, the Hicksite and the more, mainstream. It's a very, very complicated story. I won't even attempt to summarize it.
When you see some of the old maps, you see some of the farms that are listed as owned by the Society of Friends. So did Quakers live collectively, or did, like?
No, they were very much, independent people, but they adopted a very similar, lifestyle, very plain lifestyle, no ostentation. A little bit like the Amish, though not quite as extreme. And again, this policy, strict neutrality, non-participation in the war. Though several notable people from the Quaker ranks stepped forward and served in the American side. Most notably Nathaniel Greene, who's probably, apart from Washington himself, was the best general the Americans had, and he was known as the Fighting Quaker. Well, as a consequence, as soon as he enlisted, he was formally excommunicated. They didn't, they didn't cut you any slack for the revolution.
Ben Franklin a Quaker?
No, but he got along with Quakers, more or less. Sometimes less. Yeah, that's another long story. Anyway, any other?
So, because I live near St. Peter's in Westchester Square, would that have been loyalist? That area?
Well, it's hard to say, but yeah, that south end of Westchester County tended to be a bit more loyalist. And the Patriot Societies, you go into north of Westchester County, particularly up north of the Croton River, tend to be more solidly Patriot, but in between it was very, very mixed up. It literally became a war of neighbor against neighbor.
Thought that's why they moved the county seat from DeVillo of Westchester up to, first it was at Bedford, and then finally White Plains, because of, it was Tory country, and they hide the records in St. Peter's Church behind the altar because they're afraid the Americans were going to burn everything.
Yeah, I've heard that story too.
Yeah.
Well, White Plains became the county seat in, I think it was 1752.
59.
59.
59 it was.
So it was before the
Revolution,
revolution.
17 years later, the
Yeah.
revolution broke out.
The town records were in the rectory of the church. I
Ah,
saw them, they were in the safe there. I'm going back 20 years, I don't know whether they're still there or not.
hmm.
But, yeah, the one side of the book was the town records, and the other side of the book was the church records.
Oh. I'll have to have a look at that someday. Oh, one more?
Kind of get back to the spy and some of the stuff with the neutral ground. But you read the book by Ian Fraser, Paradise Bronx?
Yeah,
So he covers a lot of the same stuff. He mentions the kind of oral history that was taken in the early 1800s.
yeah.
Is that accessible to the public at the Westchester?
Yeah, it's known as
library?
it's known as the McDonald Papers. It was a guy like beginning in the 1840s. The term oral history didn't exist yet, but basically he was going around interviewing as many people as he could find that were alive, during the Revolutionary period. So he got loads and loads of stories, and not all of which you can believe without reservation, but it's a tremendously valuable source. The Westchester Historical Society I believe they have the original manuscripts. It was published at some point, I think, in the 1920s. But it's also available online. I think you can access this through Google Books. I think that's where I found it.
I think he mentioned he was going to do it, but again,
Yeah, it's
hadn't done it
a
yet.
wonderful, wonderful amount of stories, but the trouble with oral history, people's recollections 50 years later, you've got to balance it against, what you know for sure took place. People tend to remember things out of time or out of place, or sometimes just out of reality.
Right. Right.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, it's been a pleasure.